can hear me. I'm sorry to be so late. Just been having like a lot of technical issues. Let me know if you can see me and if you can hear me. That would be very helpful. Trying to check on my own. Yes, I seem to be live. Good afternoon to... Okay, the good afternoon is gone now, but good afternoon anyway. Nice to have you. Hi, I'm Shree. I'm your English educator for grades 11 and 12. We've done quite a lot of lessons by now. We're almost halfway through like one textbook for grade 12 and almost entirely done with the textbook for grade 11. But just in case you're new, you should know that the usual times that we meet is 3 to 4 p.m. every day, except for Sunday. Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays are for grade 12. Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays are for grade 11. And because today is a Monday, we're going to be doing some grade 12. We're doing a poem today. Hello to Sanuj. And as with poems, we're going to do our usual pattern that we do for poems, which is we will read the entire poem together and then we'll break it down. Generally we do it verse by verse, but because this poem is very, very full and we'll have to like really pay attention to every line very closely. We're going to be doing it like every couple of lines. And at the very end we will talk themes, we will talk poetic devices. So that's going to be the general structure of our class today. As usual, please feel free to like ask me questions down in the chat. I am checking it every couple of slides. So if you have any questions, I'll address them as we go. If you have questions that aren't connected to the lesson though, save them for the very end, and if we have time, we will take them then. Does that sound good? Hello Ashpreet. Okay. Let me just... Yes. Today we're doing an elementary school classroom in a slum by Stephen Spender. Stephen Spender is this man who is especially known for thinking a lot about equality and social justice. He was very concerned with human rights, and all of these are themes that will crop up in this poem, and you will see them as they crop up. So I will read the poem out to you now and try to listen to it as closely as you can. At the end of it, we'll talk about what you think, and then we'll get into breaking it down and understanding it. Far, far from gusty waves these children's faces, like rootless weeds, the hair torn round their pallor, the tall girl with her weighed-down head, the paper-seeming boy with rat's eyes, the stunted, unlucky heir of twisted bones, reciting a father's gnarled disease, his lesson from his desk. At back of the dim class, one unnoted, sweet and young. His eyes live in a dream of squirrel's game in tree room other than this. That's our first verse. On sour cream walls, donations. Shakespeare's head, cloudless at dawn, civilized dome riding all cities, belled, flowery Tyrolese valley, open-handed map awarding the world its world. And yet, for these children, these windows, not this map, their world, where all their futures painted with a fog, a narrow street sealed in with a lead sky far, far from rivers, capes, and stars of words. That's our second verse. And surely Shakespeare is wicked, the map a bad example, with ships in sun and love tempting them to steal, for lives that slyly turn in their cramped holes, from fog to endless night. On their slag heap, these children wear skins peeped through by bones and spectacles of steel with mended glass like bottle bits on stones. All of their time and space are foggy slum. So blot their maps with slums as big as doom. Third verse, this is our last one. Unless governor, inspector, visitor, this map becomes their window, and these windows that shut upon their lives like catacombs break open till they break the town, and show the children to green fields, and make their world run azure on gold sands, and let their tongues run naked into books the white and green leaves open, history theirs whose language is the sun. Okay, so 4 verses in this poem. First things first, what does this poem give you so far? What are your ideas? What are your thoughts? If you have any, put them in the chat. I'm looking at it right now. I'm very sorry, I don't know Hindi, so I have to speak in English. Okay. The first thing that we should look at is the title of the poem here, right? An elementary school classroom in a slum. So we have our setting, and the setting is a school classroom. It's an elementary school classroom, so it's the very beginning school years for these children, and it's in a slum, and so we know that the socio-economic status of the people in this poem is very likely to not be good at all. And so this poem's title immediately gives us a little bit about the contents of the poem. And now we're going to go into the actual contents. We're going to break it down sort of verse by verse. So first we have, far, far from gusty waves, these children's faces. So these children's faces are far away from gusty waves. Now, what gusty waves? Gusty means strong blowing wind, right? Waves here could mean ocean. But what these words actually stand for here is not nature. It is children who are happy and who have a lot of energy to them and who have a lot of life to them. So that kind of gusto, that kind of enthusiasm and strength that's there in children who come from better circumstances, that isn't there in the faces of these children. So they are not energetic, they are not enthusiastic, they seem quite weak, quite uninterested. So that's what the first line gives us. Like rootless weeds, the hair torn around their pallor. Pallor means pale face, and pale in a way that shows that you haven't had enough nutrition and you're physically not very strong. So that's what pallor means. And these children's hair is torn. It's very messily around their face. It's not been combed, it's not properly set in place. And the hair is compared to rootless weeds. Um, Weeds that are kind of just, growing messily here and there. And so the hair is being compared to that kind of messiness. Sorry about that. I don't know why that keeps cropping up. I'm not like touching anything. But yeah, so the hair is being compared to rootless weeds. But the children themselves are also being compared to rootless weeds, right? And what does this mean? What's a weed? If you know, let me know in the chat. Do you know what kind of plants weeds are? Okay, well, weeds are plants that are generally unwanted plants, right? If you have a garden and you're growing a set of plants, then the weeds are going to be those plants that just crop up there that you don't want there, that are taking away nutrition from the plants that you're growing. So you'll basically pluck those weeds out and throw them out, right? And this comparison between children and weeds tells us that these children are considered unwanted, that they're considered unnecessary, and so they're not given any proper attention, they're not given any kind of nutrition. If you see a weed, you're not going to like pour water on it and give it fertilizer and make sure that it grows more. You're just going to tear it out, as I said. And so these children don't get any sort of nutrition, not just eating wise nutrition, but any other kind of nurture, any other kind of care. So they're completely discarded by society. And they're rootless in the sense that, imagine if the weed has been fully plucked out from the earth and the roots that it needs to put in the soil in order to get some kind of food and energy in order to keep growing, those roots have been upended. And so these children have no chance of growing really, unlike the rest of society. And that's what rootless weeds tries to encompass, and that's what the children are being compared to here. I hope that's clear. Let me know if it's not. The tall girl with her weighed down head. So now we're going into a sort of description of the pupils in the classroom. And first, we get a look at this tall girl whose head is weighed down, which means that it's bent. And you have to ask now, weighed down with what? Why is her head bent? And there's no clear answer here, but we can make a guess based on the context of the poem, right? Weighed down maybe because she doesn't have any energy, because she's not getting enough food. Weighed down maybe because of shame. Weighed down maybe by just the exhaustion of her circumstances. And so there are multiple reasons that this girl's head could be weighed down. But one thing that it shows us is that she isn't like sitting up proud and straight. She isn't paying attention to what's going on in class necessarily. There are other things that may be on her mind. Our second pupil is the paper-seaming boy with rat size. Paper-seaming? Paper-seaming means thin as paper, as fragile as paper, as pale as paper. So again, it's a comment on the physical state of the boy, which is very weak and not in very good health. So it's like, I don't know if you have this phrase in your languages, but in Tamil, you say, this person could get blown away by the wind. They look that thin and that weak. So it's the same kind of meaning that comes to the paper-seaming boy. Let me know if you have phrases like that. Actually, I'd like to hear what they are. With rat size, a rat is a creature that you don't really like, right? It's a pest. If a rat's in your house, you're going to try to trap it or you're going to try to kill it, because it's there to kind of chew into things and steal your food. And here all of those meanings come together in rat size again. Unwanted, the boy is probably considered a bit of a pest with regard to society. Society's outlook on these people is that they're pests. And also in the sense that he is probably got like eyes that are searching for food. Because again, These are kids who are not being well fed and they're not getting good access to any kinds of resources, especially not to food. So that's what we get from paper singing boy with rat size. So those are our first two pupils. Our third pupil is the stunted, unlucky heir of twisted bones, reciting a father's gnarled disease, his lesson from his pen. So the third person that we're getting is someone who's stunted. Stunted means their growth has been stopped too soon. So there's something so they haven't grown entirely. And we hear that he is an unlucky heir of twisted bones, reciting a father's gnarled disease. Gnarled means knotted. And so what we're getting here from this particular line is that this third boy has a specific disease. It is a genetic disease and it has to do with bones. It causes some kind of twisting and malnutrition in the bones. This is probably rickets. That's a bone disease that's very common, and it's because of lack of access to vitamin D, I think. But yeah, it's a very common disease. And as we can see, it's a disease that can be inherited. It's a genetic condition. And so that's what we're getting from this specific line. So heir is the word that is used, and heir means someone who inherits something from the person who came before them, right? And generally use the word heir when it comes to wills and when it comes to fortunes. So for instance, if you're the heir of a millionaire, then you inherit their fortune. That's the kind of context in which heir is used. But here it's used completely differently. It's used as an heir of misfortune. So this is a boy who's unfortunately inheriting things that are really terrible, and he is very unlucky for it. And it's said that he is reciting a father's gnarled disease. Reciting, repeating, right? When you recite a poem, you're uttering the words of the poem again. And this boy is repeating in the footsteps of his father by repeating in those steps of the disease. And so here, when they say his lesson, they mean that the father's gnarled disease is his lesson, right? So what is he learning? He is learning this disease. And this is what his life is going to look like, and those are the steps that he is following in. It's very interesting because the vocabulary of the classroom, reciting, is being used to describe a disease. And because we're in a classroom setting, it's a very appropriate word, right? He is reciting this disease. So it's more in tune with the language of the classroom. But it's also interesting because if this is the lesson that he is reciting, then can he focus on other lessons? Say whatever is being taught in school, is it possible for him to think about learning other things when his life is going to be focused on figuring out how to deal with this disease, which is going to take up a lot of his time and his energy? And that's the question that is implicitly there in this line, and the question that's there implicitly throughout this paragraph. And we'll talk about it when we get to themes, whether it's possible in such circumstances for people to study at all, or for people to care about studying at all, right? At back of the dim class, one unnoted, sweet and young. His eyes live in a dream of squirrels cave in tree room other than this. And this is the very last pupil that we get told about, and it's someone who's sitting at the very back of the classroom, and the entire class here is described as dim. And this doesn't mean that they can't think, because I know dim-witted is like a phrase that people use a lot, and that's used to mean that people can't think very well. Here it just means there's a lot of darkness in this classroom, there's a lot of bleakness in this classroom, there's not really much hope or any sort of energy. These children are far from gusty waves, as we were told. And so at the very back, there's this one boy who is unnoticed, which means that he is not marked by all of these other feelings that we see in all of these other people. Physically and mentally, he doesn't seem to be affected by any of these things yet. And that's probably because he is young still, and so all of these things aren't things that have struck him yet. And his eyes live in a dream, and he is daydreaming, right? Even he isn't like sitting in the class and paying attention to what's happening. He is thinking about something else, and the something else that he's thinking about are nice things, like squirrels playing games on trees, about rooms in trees, and he's thinking about this entirely different kind of life, of fun things, of good things, of beautiful things, and anything that is not the classroom itself. And that also tells us something about why he is still unnoted and why he is still sweet and young. It tells us that, hey, he can only remain this way if he is not really thinking very much about the circumstances that he is in. He has to daydream about other things and better things in order to not get very deeply affected by what's going on around him. And that's something very common that we see all the time. If you're going through very difficult circumstances, it's a lot easier to sort of detach yourself and daydream instead of sitting in the moment and feeling all of those feelings. So that is our first verse. I'm going to check for questions now. Please ask any questions you have. Okay, should I take it that you have no questions then? Alright, then I will keep going, and I will trust you to leave questions in the comments if you're watching this later and you want any clarifications. On sour cream walls donations. Sour cream means off-white cream. It isn't precisely the color of cream. It's a little dirtied. It's not quite very pleasant to look at. And sour brings that connotation. When something goes sour, you generally say that it's spoiled, right? And that's the kind of association that we're getting with these walls. They're not very beautiful, but on them are donations, things that other people have given this classroom so that they can be put up on the walls. Shakespeare's head, cloudless at dawn, civilized dome riding all cities. So one thing that's on the classroom walls is Shakespeare's head. Another thing that's there is an image of cloudless dawns. Dawn is the beginning of the day, and a cloudless sky is generally used to say, oh, it's going to be a good day, right? When people say there are no clouds in the sky, they mean there's going to be no rain, there's going to be no obstacles today, it's going to be bright, it's going to be a good day, blue skies, happy feelings. So those are all the associations that we get with cloudless. And what we get with dawn is that it's the starting of a day, which is also full of hope, right? It's a new day, and you don't know what could happen in it, and it's beautiful. And all of those things are what we're getting from cloudless at dawn, and that's the other poster that seems to be there on the walls. And we have civilized dome riding all cities. Dome in cities seems to refer to architecture in cities. Buildings have domes on them. Generally, like if you wait, I'm trying to pick a color that will show orange, yeah. So like essay funny domes in cities at the very top, fancy buildings that you kind of can see. And I am extremely apologetic for this terrible drawing. But yeah, those kinds of domes that are at the very top of cities and that tell you, hey, the city is like a very urbanized place, and it has a lot of incredibly like modern, civilized things in it. So those kinds of domes. Some people have interpreted this to mean the sun. I'm not very sure that makes sense at all. So Civilized dome riding of cities most likely refers to those sort of domes of buildings that are at the top of cities that you can see. We also have belled flowery Tyrolese Valley. The Tyrolese Valley is this place in the Alps that is particularly well known for having a lot of flowers and again being extremely beautiful, and belled because the flowers look like bells. So yeah, all of these lovely images on the walls, and one last thing on the walls, which is an open-handed map awarding the world its world. Open-handed map. When someone is open-handed, it means they're being very inviting, right? It means I'm speaking to you with like open hands and there is no closed offness, and it means you are welcome to like walk in here. That's the kind of implication that comes with open-handed. It's an offer. So the map seems to be offering the world to everyone. And what does awarding the world its world mean? Here, its world refers to the map's world, right? So, its here is the map, and so this particular part of the sentence, its world, refers to the drawn world inside the map. And this world refers to Earth, to everything outside the map, to the people all around on this planet. So this map seems to be offering the world of people the world inside the map, suggesting, oh hey, this entire world is out there and you can go see it. So that's the kind of implication that is there in that particular poster. And so these are all the things that are on the walls of the classroom in the slum. And now I'm going to look for questions again. And yet, for these children, these windows, not this map, their world, where all their futures painted with a fog, a narrow street sealed in with a lead sky. Okay. The poet says that the world in the map, this map, is not their world, is not the world of these children. The world of these children is what's outside the windows. So when they look outside the windows, the things that they see, that is their world. And it is very, very different from this particular world that's on their walls. So we see that there is a contrast between what they can see in their classroom, that's there in those images, versus the reality of their lives. And what is the reality of their lives? Their future is painted with a fog. Their future is foggy. And if you've ever had like the real bad fortune of walking out into like a foggy day, then you know that you can't see like anything that's there anywhere around you. And there's this utter kind of uncertainty about what's going to happen, where what is. So fog carries all of that meaning. It's testing a sort of uncertainty, suggesting a lack of clarity, and it's also suggesting a sort of bleakness. In the sense, fogs are grey. It seems very dull. So the suggestion is also that their future is going to be extremely dull. There isn't a lot of hope or potential in it, and all of those meanings come in with fog. A narrow street sealed in with a lead sky, and this is also a description of their future. It's going to be a narrow street, which means there aren't many avenues for them to take. It's probably also literally a narrow street if you look outside the window. If you've been to slums or know what they're like, then you know that all the spaces there are very, very cramped. So narrow street could easily refer to what's immediately outside the window when you look at it. And it's also doubling as a reference to their future, where their paths are very narrow and there aren't many options for them to pursue. There aren't many different kinds of lives that are ahead of them. And the street is sealed in with a lead sky. at the end of the street, there seems to be a lead sky. Now, lead sky means grey sky because lead is a dark grey in shade. This also is a kind of literal thing that you could see if you look outside the window. You could see like a narrow street, and at the end of it you could see like a very grey sky. And that could be a reference to the kind of places they live in, which is areas that are maybe extremely polluted, and so the skies are extremely grey. As we read in like the fourth stanza, I think, these children, are said to be living on a slag heap, and a slag heap is leftover waste from like industries. So it would make sense if this area is extremely polluted, and that pollution is making the sky very dark. But it's also doubling again to mean something else, which is that a dark sky, not a bright sky, not a happy sky, not a clear sky, but a grey sky. That kind of fogginess comes back in, and the street is sealed in, which means it's closed off. There is nowhere to go beyond this street. And lead doubles here. It seems sort of like, the lead sky is like the top of a tiffin box dabba that's just put down on the tiffin box. Yeah, that kind of thing, that kind of imagery comes in, as though the sky is blocking them off from going anywhere else. And that's what their future looks like. And that future is far, far from rivers, caves, and stars of words. It's far, far from rivers which are flowing, and again, a kind of natural thing that's very beautiful, which is very far away from this industrial lead sky. Capes are associated with heroes and superheroes, and that kind of thing is not what their lives are heading towards. And very far from stars of words. This is a reference to our Shakespeare here. He is a star of words. He is very well known for the way that he can play with words and things that he can do with words. Not a literal star, but like a superstar with words. And that kind of thing isn't something that is in their future very much. It's actually very, very far from what their future is, and very, very far from what their world is. So very, very intense paragraph, and I'm just gonna verse, not paragraph. And I'm just gonna go over like both of these segments, like 1 second. This is basically giving us the inside of the classroom, which has got all these pictures in it, and it's giving us the outside of the classroom, and it's striking a strong contrast, right? Immediately we know that what is on these walls is not what these children see, it's not what their lives are like. And the poet tells us, surely Shakespeare is wicked, the map a bad example, with ships in sun and love tempting them to steal. And the poet tells us Shakespeare is wicked, is evil, and this map is a really bad thing to put on the wall. All of these posters are really terrible things to put on the wall. And why are they terrible things to put on the wall? Because they'll tempt these children to steal. What the poet is trying to emphasize here is that it is incredibly unfair to put all these things on the wall and make these children realize, first, that all of these things exist out there, and second, that all of these things are unlikely to be part of their own realities, right? So it's not actually Shakespeare who's wicked, and it's not actually the map that's a bad example. It's just that in this context, they're very bitter things to put on the wall. And the poet includes in this set of things that the children can't access, and so looking at it will make them feel like really terrible. Ships and suns and love. Now, ships, Shakespeare, map, they all seem like understandable things, right? They are things that it requires you to have a certain set of resources to be able to see the entire world, or it requires you to have a certain set of resources to be able to study Shakespeare very seriously, and it definitely requires you to have a certain set of resources to be able to go on a ship. But one would think that the sun and love is something that is open to everybody, right? It's something that anyone can have at any point of time. But we've learned that these children live in a place that is industrial, with these lead skies, polluted skies, so they probably don't get to see a lot of the sun. They don't get to see a lot of nature, and so sun becomes a stand-in here for nature itself, and they don't get to see a lot of those kinds of things that are out there, beautiful things like, doesn't have to be the Tyrolese Valley, but it could just be like a nice river and a nice park, and those things aren't part of their lives. And love becomes something that is very difficult in this context, because let's go back to that first verse, and we saw how all of these children are unable to pay a lot of attention to what's going on in class, right? There are other things that are taking up space in their minds, and just like that, the idea of love also becomes something that is a bit of a far reach for them, not because it's impossible for them to feel, but because very often when other priorities take up space in our mind, things like love become a little bit more difficult for us to pay attention to or to focus on. We end up having different kinds of priorities, and that's what the poet is trying to bring across here, that their circumstances prevent them from actually getting to any of these multiple things that are depicted on the walls. And the poet says they are bad because they tempt these children to steal. Now, this could mean two things. One, it could mean that they actually go and steal in order to try and make their economic circumstances a little bit better, to try and reduce their poverty a little bit. Another thing it could mean is that they are stealing in the sense they will spend their lives sort of trying their best to get to these things like ships and suns, the sun, there aren't multiple suns, but yeah, they'll spend their lives trying to get to them, and it'll be stealing in the sense that it isn't something that belongs to them, it isn't something that they are allowed to have, and allowed by the structures of society, by the setup of society. And so stealing in that sense, their desire for it itself is like thieving, because of the unfair ways in which society is structured. I'm going to check in to see if you have questions again. Okay, no questions. So I will carry on. For lives that slyly turn in their cramped holes from fog to endless night. So this is carrying on from this line. It's telling us that these posters are not good things. For lives that slyly turn in their cramped holes from fog to endless night. And these are the lives of the children in this slum. Cramped holes, very claustrophobic, small spaces. We see first that it could refer to houses, the sorts of houses that they end up living in, which are very small and very claustrophobic, packed with a lot of people. Cramped holes also reminds us sort of about that rat imagery that we had in that very first verse. So it brings back that kind of implication that they're kind of just living in these very shattered little shack spaces wherever they can make them. And their lives change from fog to endless night. Fog imagery, again, that bleakness, that uncertainty, that grayness. And from fog, their lives will slip into endless night, into darkness. And this night imagery is, this darkness imagery is to signify there won't be good or happy things in their lives. There will only be terrible and dreadful things in their lives. And it's endless, so it'll be night forever. So grey that fades to black, basically. And it's sly because it doesn't happen very obviously. It happens very slowly, very slipperily over a long duration of time. So at some point it'll seem like it's just fog, and fog builds up, and eventually you are in deep night. Give me a second to grab some water. relatively clear. Hello to Soumya. Good evening. Oh, it is almost evening. 4. Okay, so let's keep going. On their slag heap, these children wear skins peeped through by bones and spectacles of steel with mended glass like bottle with some stones. Slag heap, wastage from industries, and it says these children are on the slag heap. What this means is that they're living in a space, and the slum is in a space where this industrial waste is discarded. But it creates an image where if you close your eyes, then what you see is like piles of like waste and the children being forced to sit on them or lie on them. It's a very effective image in your mind. And these children wear skins peeped through by bones, which means that their bones seem to be like peeping through, like looking through their skin. So that's how skinny they are. Most of their body is made up of very sharp, hooky bones, and they don't have a lot of fat or flesh on them. And they're wearing spectacles of steel with mended glass like bottle bits on stones. So the glass segments of their spectacles are so broken that they've had to be mended, and they look like if you took a glass bottle and you threw it on stones and it shattered into like little bits, those kinds of like small shards of glasses is what their spectacles look like they've been patched together like that. So that's what this line means. All of their time and space are foggy slum. So plot their maps with slums as big as 2. The poet says the only thing that is in their physical space is this slum, this foggy slum. So, and all of their time is also this foggy slum, which means that for the future also and for the present, the only things that are going to be in their lives is this slum, right? They don't get the chance to ever get out of here. There is no point of time that they're out of here, and there is no other space that they've seen, and this is the extent of their lives. So what you should do is, when you're making these maps and you're going to put it on the walls of these children's classrooms, you're going to blot them, and blot is stain, and map making like requires using ink, or it used to once upon a time. So like that, you're just going to blot it with slums as big as 2. So on the maps, what you're going to do is you're going to put these images of slums, and they're going to be like very big images of slums, and they're going to take up space in the map. And that's what you should put up on their walls. Now, the poet doesn't, the poet is saying this in order to tell people that it is quite hypocritic and quite frustrating that there are all of these people who will donate all of these things to these schools and slums, these beautiful things, and maybe not think that there are other ways in which they could help these children also. So that's the kind of implication that's going on there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that theme when we hit the beginning of the next verse. I'm going to check for questions again. Oh, I'm good. And thank you, Soumya. That's very sweet. How are you? Okay, good to know. Yeah, so the poet is, again, as I said, not being serious about this, right? He's just making a point to whoever is reading this poem that it's not fair to give them such limited access to the world outside through these posters. Unless governor, inspector, visitor, this map becomes their window, and these windows that shut upon their lives like catacombs break open till they break the town. So, at the very beginning, governor, inspector, visitor, these are the people that the poet is now speaking to very directly in the last verse. To governors, political authorities, to inspectors, people who are also political authorities who check in on different places and see that they're doing okay. Think about like school inspectors, for instance. Visitors, people who come in from the outside and see what's going on here. And he says, all of you people, what you can do is, you can make the map on their walls, the map of the world, their window. So when they look outside their windows, make it so that what is in that map becomes reality outside their windows. And the actual windows that are there right now, these windows that shut upon their lives like catacombs, which, you know, the narrow street, that street sealed with like the lead sky, those windows that are there right now that shut down their lives and make them claustrophobic and make it impossible for them to move outside the current state of their lives, break those. Break those windows and break until this entire town breaks. So until this entire circumstance, until this entire slum becomes no more. Multiple things to talk about here. Catacombs. Catacombs are underground tombs, right? So the implication here is that currently the situation that these children are living in are like tombs. They are alive, but it's not much of a life, and it's going to be a life full of struggle and full of pain. So it's like they are dead. It's a very shut down, claustrophobic life with not much potential and not much happiness. And this is what should be broken, and the slum should be broken in the sense that it shouldn't be necessary for people to have to live in such circumstances. It should be possible for us to make better circumstances for people to live in, and nobody should have to be forced to live in areas that are filled with industrial slag, or that don't allow these children to have much of lives, or don't allow people in general to have much of a life. And instead, their lives should all be transported into a state of being in which the map on the world could be reality for them. And when this line says this map becomes their window, it doesn't just mean that it will be right outside their window. It means it becomes a window of possibility, something they can sort of look at and think about actually seeing someday in their lives. And those are the many kinds of implications that are there in this part of the paragraph. Verse, I keep calling it a paragraph, sorry. And having broken this town down, having broken these terrible foggy windows with narrow streets, lead skies down, what are these governors, inspectors and visitors supposed to do? They're supposed to show the children to green fields and make their world run azure on gold sands. Azure is this really beautiful blue color. So azure on gold sands is beaches. It's referring to the ocean. So you're supposed to break this down and show the children to green places, to parks and fields and to oceans, to nature outside, beautiful things outside, and let their tongues run naked into books, the white and green leaves. So the tongues of these children should be allowed to run naked. Naked here means untrapped, free, without any sort of restriction on them. These tongues are supposed to just be able to be exposed to books. And what kinds of books? White and green leaves. White leaves refers to actual physical books that we read. Green leaves refers to nature. So the leaves that are on trees. So these children should be allowed to freely expose themselves to reading books and to experiencing nature. Their tongues is just a way of like referring to the entire children themselves, not just their tongues, right? And what will all of this do? What will the children getting to see all of this and do all of this do? It will open history theirs. So it will open up history of their own, in the sense they will have the chance to make their own histories, to make a future for themselves that can go down in a history book. Theirs whose language is the sun. And this is only possible, the capacity to make a history of your own is only possible if your language is the sun. Which means if you can live like you live in the sun rather than you live in the fog. So the contrast being struck up here is in terms of weather, but the emotional and mental implications are that fog is bleakness and dullness and unhappiness and a lot of uncertainty, and the sun is bright and it's warm and there's a lot of light and there's a lot of hope, there's a lot of potential and possibility, and the sun is also sort of clarity, right? You can see things in front of you, you can see things that you can do. So those are all of the implications that come with the sun. And so basically give these children a life that is completely contrasted from this foggy life, which is full of sunshine, which is full of nature, which is full of exposure to all these books. And that is how the poet ends this poem. That was very long. Hi Soumya, yes, I also teach class 11. I teach class 11 on Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays, and it's from 3 to 4. So there are like, let me know if you can see me. I'm very sorry again. Not sure what's going on. Let me know if you can see me and if you can hear me. But anyway, we just finished reading the poem, so let's talk themes. Just waiting to see if I'm here. Themes won't take us too much time, and then we can do the poetic devices. If we have like doubts about that, then we can come back and do it again. Okay, I am here, which is great. So some themes in this poem, and they're very obvious ones. The first one is disparity, right? The differences in certain people's ways of life and other people's ways of life, and how money can really make a very big difference in the way that we end up living. And we see that disparity especially clearly in those two verses in the middle of the poem, where we get a world inside the classroom that's being described, the lives of these children in the slum. And we get the world outside, which is very, very different. So that contrast that's struck up there is depicting the kind of lives that these children end up having versus children, say, who have access to a lot more resources end up having. So disparity between different socioeconomic classes is the first major idea that gets communicated in this poem. And it comes through via these posters, right? These posters are donations, so they've been given to these children by people who are better off or who could afford to give away these things to these children. And so these people who do see things that are like the things that are on those posters in their lives have possibly donated these things to these children. And that's what the posters serve to highlight for us. They give us a link between the children and the outside world, and yet they also emphasize the distance between the children and the outside world. And the contrast is there in the ways that the posters are described as opposed to the way that the slum and the children's lives are described. In the poster is Shakespeare, a literary genius. There is a sky that's beautiful and cloudless and full of sunshine and these big buildings, and all of this makes for big things that are bright things and full of potential, and you have this valley full of flowers, so a lot of nature and a lot of pretty nature. And in contrast you have the slum with its narrow street, its lead sky that's blocking things off. You have this bleak fog, this night that is being associated with the lives of these children. So all of this sunlight versus all of this fog, all of this brightness versus all of this darkness, all of these open big spaces like cities and like skies and like valleys, as opposed to that very narrow street and cramped holes. All the imagery that's coming to us about the world outside versus the world in the slum puts them at complete odds. Even in the end, the sense that we get when the poet says break the town and let them out is of this very narrow space that's being broken open to expand their lives into the world, which is a lot bigger. So those are the two kinds of worlds that we get in these pictures. In this poem, not in these pictures, sorry. And another thing is that this poem is especially interesting when we put it in conversation with our last lesson, which was the Lost Spring, Stories of Stolen Childhood. And in that, Anise Jung writes about all of these kids who don't have access to education, right? Who simply can't go to school at all. And here in this poem, we get a depiction of kids in a classroom and yet sharing very terrible socio-economic situations with those kids in Lost Spring. And really the question is, what happens to these kids in this classroom? Let me know if you have any answers to that. Okay, well, what happens to these kids in the classroom is depicted in that very first verse, right? Their heads are weighed down. The kid is said to be reciting the genetic disease. One kid is just sort of sitting there and he looks like paper. And the implication is that these kids can't really focus on their education or think very seriously about education or pay much attention even in that moment to what's going on in class, because there are just other things that are occupying all their attention. They don't have the physical strength required to think about education, and they don't have the mental space to think about education. So physical kind of impacts we see in the pallor, in the stuntedness, the fact that they're probably not getting nutrition, and the mental we see in the weighed down head, in reciting the lesson, and even that little boy who's still sort of bright and doesn't seem as miserable as everybody else. He's still far away. He still detaches from the situation in order to to stay somewhat happy. And so we see that there isn't really much of a possibility that education is very meaningful in these circumstances, simply because it can't be meaningful in these circumstances. Simply because education is not really very important compared to all the other things that these kids are likely going through. So this classroom becomes a sort of farce, right? It's not something, it's more a joke, and the school itself becomes a little bit of a joke rather than something that these kids can take seriously or anybody can take seriously. So that's another thing that this poem is trying to give us, how even though you might be able to sit in a class, you might not really be able to focus on the class or take anything away from the class unless the conditions that you're in are good. And that's been a common issue this pandemic especially. People have been struggling a lot to focus on classes, on school, on university lessons, everything, because there's just so many big things going on outside you, and you end up feeling a little bit like what's happening on the screen is very far away and not something very important to you. Same kind of thing that's happening there. Their situation and circumstance makes it difficult for them to care. So we see that it's not enough to just have a school and have a classroom. It's also necessary for all of the environmental situations to be like top notch in order for people to be able to actually take advantage of resources like education. And the last thing that I want to talk about as a theme of this poem is that this poem is not just informative, right? Again, a good comparison point is Lost Spring. In that, Anise Jung gives us information about the lives of all of these children. She's telling us what their lives are like, what kind of things they can do, what kind of things they can't do, and how the situation is. So it's very informative and it's very evocative also, because you feel a lot of things when you're reading it. In this poem, at the very end, what the poet does is the poet makes it very clear that this poem is also a direction, a sort of instruction. He says, governors, inspectors, visitors, all of you people who are capable of changing the way that this thing is right now, you must do it. If you do it, then it's possible for these donations that you make to actually make some sort of a difference. So the entire poem is meant to be kind of pushing people into action, pushing people who can make a real change into going and making a real change. And that's the kind of direction that this poem is going in, as we see in that very last verse, which says, break open these things for these children, make things better for these children. Currently, the way things are, they are quite meaningless. Putting these posters in their walls, it's meaningless. It might make these walls look pretty, but it doesn't make their lives any better. The sourness of the walls behind these posters are still there. The unpleasantness of their lives outside this room is still there. That is still their environment. And so everything that is happening in this classroom and that is on these posters is empty unless you change the circumstances that are around them. So this entire poem is kind of building up to tell us, you are doing all of these things wrong, and these are the ways in which we have to change things before we can actually make these kids' lives better, right? So that's what the poem is heading towards. It's a bit of an instructive poem. That is the last theme I wanted to talk to you about. But now we can do Poetic Devices. Before we do that, I'm just gonna let us kind of read the entire poem again once, so that we get like a good sense of the poem. And then after we're done with it, we can talk about the Poetic Devices. Actually, I'm going to read it out with you. Far, far from gusty waves, these children's faces. Like rootless weeds, the hair torn around their pallor, the tall girl with her weighed down head, the paper-seeming boy with rat's eyes, the stunted, unlucky air of twisted bones, reciting a father's gnarled disease, his lesson from his desk. At back of the dim class, one unnoted, sweet and young. His eyes live in a dream of squirrel's game in tree room, other than this. On sour cream walls, donations. Shakespeare's head, cloudless at dawn, civilized dome riding on cities, belled, flowery Tyrolese valley, open-handed map awarding the world its world. And yet, for these children, these windows, not this map, their world, where all their futures painted with a fog, a narrow street sealed in with a lead sky, far, far from rivers, capes, and stars of words. Surely Shakespeare is wicked, the map a bad example, with ships and sun and love tempting them to steal, for lives that slyly turn in their cramped holes from fog to endless night. On their slag heap, these children wear skins peeped through by bones and spectacles of steel with mended glass, like bottle bits on stones. All of their time and space are foggy slum, so blot their maps with slum's biggest one. Unless governor, inspector, visitor, this map becomes their window, and these windows that shut upon their lives like catacombs break open till they break the town and show the children to green fields, and make their world run azure on gold sands, and let their tongues run naked into books the white and green leaves open history, theirs whose language is the sun. That's the entire poem again, and now tell me if there is a rhyme scheme to this poem. If you're watching this later, then think about it for like a couple of seconds. There is no rhyme scheme for this poem, and so this poem is an example of blank verse, which is actually what all of your poetry so far in grade 12 has been, which means that it doesn't really try to rhyme the ends of sentences with each other, it just goes with whatever flow it wants. As I keep saying in like every poem class, blank verse is like really popular these days, but apparently also beforehand, because we're reading a lot of blank verse from olden times here. And now we're going to talk very quickly about a bunch of poetic devices. First, to start with the easiest, alliteration. Alliteration is the poetic device in which two words that are right next to each other start with the same sound. There is a lot of alliteration in this poem. I'm sure I've not actually picked out all of it. So root through the poem. If you find more, put them in the comments and I'll take a look and let you know if you're right or not. But these are a couple: from, for, lives like, la, bottle bits, ba, street sealed, sa, far, from, fa. So alliteration is when the starting sound is the same, and the starting sound for all of these little like phrases is the same. So these are all some examples of alliteration that are there in the poem. There's also some repetition. Repetition is just when the words repeat to emphasize something, and we have two examples of this in the poem. There is break, and there is far. These are the two moments of repetition in this poem, and this is also a very easily observable poetic device. We have three similes in this poem. Similes are when two things are being compared to each other, and it's a very direct comparison in the sense that generally there will be a connecting word that shows that a comparison is being made, like or as, and so this presence of like when there is a comparison being made generally indicates that there is a simile there. And we have three similes, as I said. Windows that shut down their lives like catacombs, windows being compared to catacombs, so the windows are not opening into anything, but rather they are like underground tombs. They're like coffins that you're buried in, basically. And this simile is basically comparing the outside of the classroom, those areas in the slum with their narrow streets, two tombs, two death sentences, in the sense that you can't really live much of a life in such places. Your life is very limited and restricted by the situation. And so that's the comparison that's being made here between the world outside those windows and these tombs. And the comparison is being made to the window because when you look outside the window and the view that you have there, that view is what is being referred to when they say windows. That's what is shutting down their lives. So that's the comparison that's going on here. The comparison that's going on here is of mended glass and spectacles with bottle bits on stone. We already talked about this when you break a bottle on stone and it breaks into bits. Yeah, these children's spectacles are so cracked and that they look a little bit like a glass bottle that's been broken into bits. That's how badly these spectacles look. That's how terribly shattered they are. That's how much they've had to be mended, repaired. So that's our second simile, mended glass with bottle bits on stone. This simile is like rootless weeds. The rootless weeds here are the children. You could also say it's the hair, and we spoke about this also in some detail, the messy hair, but also rootless weeds as the children, in the sense that these children aren't getting any kind of nutrition, like plants without roots wouldn't get any kind of nutrition, and this is both mental nutrition and physical nutrition. As I said, they don't have the space to really think about other things, so they're not really getting much of mental nutrition. They also aren't getting physical nutrition, which we know from their pallor, their weakness, the genetic disease that's mentioned. And weeds, in the sense that weeds are plants that are unwanted, right? They're not plants that you're trying to grow, they're plants that you pluck out of the garden, so they're unwanted. These children don't belong to a segment of society that is paid much attention to, that is nurtured, that is grown very well. They're kind of just pulled out and plucked out and discarded, and all of that is going on in that simile. We also have a bunch, like an entire bunch of metaphors in this poem. And a metaphor is also a comparison, right? Except it's not a direct comparison like a simile. It's a very indirect one. In the sense that, let's look through the examples and you'll kind of get what I mean. So here we have futures painted with a fog. Now this is a metaphor because fog here doesn't mean fog. Fog means bleakness, dullness, uncertainty, right? So the weather situation of a foggy day is being compared to bleakness, uncertainty, and all of the qualities that come with a foggy day. And so that kind of comparison is very implicit. It's just taken for granted that you will understand what fog means here. And that kind of absence of like or absence of as, when there's a kind of comparison being made, that generally tells you that it's a metaphor. Sealed in with the lead sky is a metaphor. Actually, narrow street sealed in with the lead sky is a metaphor because it seems to be referring to a physical space in which there is a very tight street, and at the end of it there is a dark grey sky. But we talked about how what this line actually means is that their future is not full of opportunities, it's very limited, and the narrowness of the street depicts the narrowness of the opportunities of their future, and it's shut down by a dark sky. And so all there is this terribly dark future in front of them. There isn't potential or sunshine or hope. So again, this physical space actually implies something very different about their future. Stars of words, this phrase sounds like it's referring to a constellation of words, a group of words put in the form of a star or something, but it actually is referring to Shakespeare or literary geniuses or people who can really spend some time thinking about words and learning them enough to become very well versed in them. So that's what this is a metaphor for. From fog to endless night is also a metaphor because, again, it seems like it's describing, the sky, the weather, fog and night, except it's actually referring again to their lives, and it's referring to the sort of bleakness of their lives, the dullness of their lives that is turning into darkness and a life with no hope and completely empty of any sort of good thing. So all of these words are standing in for other kinds of meanings, and that's why they're all metaphors. We have a couple more. We have whose language is the sun. Again, weather, climate, metaphor. Language is the sun. Your language can't be the sun. It just means that the sun is clarity and clearness and brightness and hope, as we talked about. So all of those things become things that they can access. Let their tongues run naked into books. Their tongues aren't actually going to be like running naked into books. It's free tongues, tongues that aren't like trapped by anything, that have free range to read anything. And that's the meaning of let their tongues run into books. Naked, again, untrapped, free. So that's what let their tongues run naked into books means. Their skins peeped through by bones. Well, it sounds as though, the bones are like looking through the skin, right? And what this means is that the bones are actually, they're just very bony children. They're, very thin, right? And that's what that means. So all of these are poetic devices. I know we did that really fast. I'm very sorry for how fast it was. It's just that I have to close this session. But we'll revise it again when we go over, when we do the quiz, which we will do on Wednesday. So there is a quiz on Wednesday. So do come by if you're interested in revising the last two lessons, which is the spawn and the lost spring. So we'll be revising those on Wednesday. Come by if you would like to. It'll be fun. And you can find a lot of content like this and more quizzes to try on the Unacademy app. You can download it and you can use my code, which is THAR01, to get access to a lot of features for free. And you should check it out just because it has things like how to ask a doubt, for instance, and you can basically put your doubt on the Unacademy app and people will respond to you, and that's very useful. So you should take advantage of that. And there is also something called Unacademy Plus, in which you basically get access to a lot of free courses, a lot of doubt clearing sessions. You get free access to study material and practice tests, and there'll be a lot of live tests too. And they'll cover every bit of your syllabus, right? So Unacademy Plus is something you should know about, and these are the prices of Unacademy Plus, and you can see that the cost per month is a lot less when you take it for a longer duration of time. There's also something called Unacademy Iconic, and in Iconic you basically get access to one-on-one tutoring. It's like you and an educator sitting down and finishing your lessons together, and you get access to doubt clearing again. You get to ask your doubts. Your parents get to be in touch with the educators and kind of ask how you're doing. You get weekly reports and stuff like that. And you get access to everything else that Unacademy always offers. So it's additional stuff on top of Plus. So that's Unacademy Iconic. And these are the prices. And again, you can see that the per month cost is a lot less if you take the subscription for a longer duration of time. For both of these things, you can add a referral code in order to get a 10% discount. And mine is THAR01, as I said. all of this to say, check out the app. It has cool things on it. Check out these subscriptions. They have cool things going on there too. Thank you for being here today with me. And if you like the class, then do hit like. Leave comments if you have questions, if you have feedback. I will be paying attention to the comments. So I will definitely get back to you. And do subscribe if you're looking for more content of this kind. See you.